me about Randolph.
Randolph the Red, so named for his bright red hair, was considered a hero at the Battle of Poitiers. For his heroism, King Edward III awarded him with the lands in the region called Penvellyn. That's how we got our name.
Odo, that's an odd name.
Yeah, he isn't very exciting really, like farming and cows. His son Milo is much more interesting.
Tell me about Simon.
He lived from 1358 to 1412. No, 1411. We don't know very much about him.
Who was Anor?
He was Odo's brother.
Who was Agatha?
She was a nun. I think she lived in Ireland.
Who was Marjorie?
She died when she was a little girl. It was really sad.
What did Guido do?
He made pizza. No, I'm joking, of course. I don't know anything about him except that he died in 1433 because he outlived all of his siblings.
What about Milo?
Milo inherited not only his grandfather's red hair, but his military prowess. Milo was instrumental in the siege of Caen and was awarded even more lands by Henry V.
What do you know about Cecilia?
She married the Lord of Limerick and did a lot of needlework. She had a ton of kids too, like 20. Can you imagine?
What about Jacobus?
He died when he was like 9.
And Hugo?
He had a lot of kids, and his dates were 1401 to 1466.
Tell me about Albert.
He was very mysterious, and the people of Blackmoor were afraid of him because he knew all these scientific things. No one knows much about him, though.
Who was Robertus?
He was a knight, but died in some kind of jousting tournament. He was twins with Josephus.
Who was Josephus?
Yeah, they used a lot of Latin names back then and weird spellings. He became like a priest or parson or something.
Who was Anisha?
A nun.
Who was Jeanette?
It's Genet. I think he wrote plays, maybe. I don't know, I forget.
Tell me about Lucia.
Isn't that a pretty name? If I have a daughter, I'll name her that.
Who was Adam?
Like he married Eve. Duh, no kidding. I actually don't know anything about him. I think he was the son of Hugo, though, but I forget.
Who was Joan? Is that misspelled?
No, that's how they spelled it then. She got married to this duke somewhere in Flanders.
Tell me about Edmund.
He was into cows. He did a lot of breeding of cows and sheep and got some kind of award from the king.
Who was Nicolina?
She died when she was a baby. I have many ancestors who died young, but Ethel said that Penvellyns in general live a long time.
Tell me about Walter.
He was born in 1448 or 9. I'm kind of bored doing this right now.
Who was Marge?
I forget. I think she was... I don't know.
Who was Charles?
Oh, Charles was a famous judge and wrote very important books on law. But his boy, Garrett, drowned while he was really young.
Who was Gillian?
She married the Duke of Ballingsford, but she stayed at Blackmoor to raise her son Thomas, who inherited the estate when his grandfather Charles died.
Tell me about Garrett.
He drowned on his 19th birthday.
Tell me about Thomas.
He was Charles's grandson and wrote a lot of poetry. He also had 3 wives, Catherine, Anne, and Mary, but not like at the same time. They died and he just remarried.
Who's James?
He never married, but one day, when he was very old, a baby was found at the doorstep to the manor. He took her in and raised her as his own. That was Eleanor.
Who was Elizabeth?
Like the Queen of England? Oh, you mean Elizabeth, my ancestor. It's weird that she's the only ancestor named Elizabeth, since it's such a popular name.
What did Francis do?
He got into a big fight with his brother James and lived in France.
Tell me about Geoffrey.
I'd rather not. I'm kind of bored. Wouldn't you rather play a game?
Can you tell me about George, the one born in 1566?
Nah, he lived and died. End of story.
What can you tell me about Eleanor?
Just that she was burned as a witch, but it wasn't true, and her father, James, died when he saw her die, and then the family fled to France. I don't want to talk about this.
Who was Edward?
He lived in France with his father, Le Comte de Roquefort. He was very interested in languages and translated books from Greek and Latin.
Who was Virginie?
She was married to the Duke of Barrowbold and died in the Great Fire of London.
Tell me about Francois.
He was a dwarf and became a trusted confidant to Louis XIV. Little people often held positions of great esteem at that time.
Tell me about Corbin.
I don't know. He doesn't have a coat of arms in the Great Hall because he didn't live here. Wasn't even a British subject, that's all I know.
Who was Frederic?
He was a soldier for the French. He was killed in the War of Spanish Succession in July of 1702.
Who was Helene?
Can we stop soon? Helene married the Duke of Bouville and died in 1760. End of story.
What about Colin?
Oh, this is so cool. They say he was a spy for England, even though he lived in France. Isn't that so very? I'd like to be a spy.
And Philippe?
He made a fortune in the New World and bought back most of the lands that were confiscated by Cromwell.
Who was Théophile?
He lived most of his life on the island of Mauritius and discovered like 1 million plant species.
Tell me about Brigitte, the one who was born in the 17th century.
She was absolutely mad about cricket, the game, not the insect. She actually saw the first cricket match in 1744. Personally, though, I can't stand the sport.
Who's Penelope?
I don't know much about her except that she was very loved by practically everyone in England, and there were 1 million poems written about her. If I have a boyfriend, I'd never let him write a poem about me. Blech.
It looks like George and his brother Henri died in the same year. What happened?
They were lost at sea. I guess they traveled a lot to Canada, especially to Oak Island.
It looks like George and his brother Henri died in the same year. What happened?
They were lost at sea. I guess they traveled a lot to Canada, especially to Oak Island.
Who's Marianne?
She got shipwrecked on this deserted island with a whole bunch of yahoos, and they wrote a story about it. Yeah, that's it.
Tell me about Jean.
Hello, it's pronounced Jean. He was killed by a boar on a hunting trip. They eat people's flesh, you know? No, I'm kidding. But he really did get killed by a boar. Serves him right, though, for hunting some poor little animal.
Tell me about Martha.
She was completely daft. She'd wear really bizarre outfits, and she was one of the first women to ride on a steam train.
What do you know about John?
He was an opera singer, just like my mom. He sang in some Mozart operas, I think.
Tell me about Brigitte, the one born in 1759.
She never married and was bonkers for astronomy. She adopted her sister's son, Richard, who later got killed at Waterloo.
Who was Peter?
Let's see. He had a wooden leg and he was attacked by wolves once. That's all I remember.
Who was born in 1763?
That was Isabel. She wrote many letters about the French Revolution and actually saw Marat's dead body in the bathtub. Talk about gross!
Who was Jacques?
Don't laugh, but he invented the lawnmower bag in 1831. I swear I'm totally not making this up.
Tell me about Richard.
He died in Waterloo fighting against Napoleon.
Tell me about Edward, the one from the 19th century.
He was a big explorer and went all over the world. He wasn't very close with his son, who was also an explorer. They'd only see each other by chance in weird remote places like Samarkand and Walla Walla.
Who was Caroline?
Caroline was a chemist and helped identify the element lanthanum. I'm not sure what the element does. I think it's a heavy metal.
Who was the William who died so young?
He was Edward's little brother. He named his son after him.
Who was William?
He was an explorer just like his father. He was kind of a whiner, so I heard.
Were Cassandra and Hector twins?
Uh-huh. Cassandra was totally obsessed with lawn tennis and was one of the first people in England to have a court installed at her home. Hector was the first ball boy.
Were Cassandra and Hector twins?
Uh-huh. Cassandra was totally obsessed with lawn tennis and was one of the first people in England to have a court installed at her home. Hector was the first ball boy.
Who was Cynthia?
I don't know. I'm kind of tired right now.
Wow, Catherine sure lived for a long time.
She lived the longest of any Penvellyn. I hope I live that long, but not if I'm all, like, creaky and cranky.
What did Sophia do?
She was a big collector of Impressionist artwork, but most of it was destroyed in a fire.
Tell me about Arthur.
He lived in the Wild West in the Americas and was a bandit with El Diablo's gang.
Tell me about Rose.
It's a real sad story. She and her granddaughter Rachel lived in France during the war and were killed.
Who was John, the one who was born in 1873?
He was this huge naturalist and did a lot of exploration in the Amazon. I think there's a plant named after him. Or maybe a monkey, I forget.
Who was Malachi?
He was a doctor of medicine and did a lot of research on icky skin diseases. Happily, I'm blessed with perfect skin.
Who was Rachel?
She died in France during the war. I guess she worked for the French resistance.
Tell me about Obadiah.
He lived in the US for most of his life and married this weird woman named Eustacia. She's still alive and sometimes calls us. She's totally creepy.
Who was Esther?
Esther Penvellyn Romberg, born in 1897 and died in 1951. Her friends called her Polly.
What did Nahum do?
He died in the flu epidemic.
Who was Alan?
He was my grandfather, but I didn't know him because he died when I was little. I guess he was nice.
What do you know about Letitia?
Loves plants, hates noise. You can ask her about it. She's usually in the conservatory with her plants.